today is talking about trauma and stress in healthcare, and I want to emphasize the stress part because it actually is a really broad topic, and I do want to approach it as a generalist would, rather than I'm not a specialist in trauma care. But I've seen lots of folks who have a history of trauma and who are struggling with sort of the after effects of it. So I've have a fair amount of experience, but it is helpful to try and take as holistic a perspective as possible. So that's what I'm going to try and do today. Um, So today we have about an hour. So while you're eating your lunch, a couple of things we're gonna try and tackle. So I want to talk about trauma, how we define it in the context of stress and what stress is, and particularly how that applies to folks who work in healthcare. And then I want to talk about four different responses that people can have to trauma and stress, and then talk a little bit about how to manage those. And it's a huge topic, and I'm sure we could do a 2-day talk on all of the different things that we do and you might want to try, and in terms of understanding all of this. But we're going to give you a really broad overview in the hour, and hopefully some practical ideas about at least where you're going to go, where you go if you wanted help with these sorts of things, or if you have someone you know that needs help with those, what you might uh, kind of the broad principles that where you might go next. Okay, so I'm a psychiatrist, and some of you will be familiar with the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. This is the psychiatrist's Bible. It's been around really, the way we use it in the modern context, it's been around since about 1980, and it's a tool that we use to define and discriminate between different disorders, and as well as between what we consider to be a disorder and what we consider to be normal. And it's a tome. It's expanded over the years, and it was originally used really as a way of trying to get psychiatrists on the same page so that we could be consistent in the things that we diagnose. Because in the past, and maybe to some extent now still, uh, your diagnosis kind of depended on which psychiatrist you went to see. And so there was a real push to get consistency. And what that has done is it's helped us to have more solid and reliable research. And so there's plenty of critiques out there about the DSM. I don't want to get too much into it, but I do want to talk about specifically why a DSM approach to trauma in healthcare might be problematic. So the first thing is that when we think about trauma in the DSM, it really shows up in two different conditions. One's called acute stress disorder, and the other one is post-traumatic stress disorder. And these two disorders are very, very strictly defined. And basically, it's an in or out sort of diagnosis. It's a binary. It's you are this or you are that. You either have the diagnosis or you don't. And it's a way of discriminating between all of those sorts of things, which actually, again, it is helpful for research. Sometimes it can help a little bit with treatment, and it's really helpful for lawyers and for insurance companies who are deciding who they're going to give money to or not, actually. And so that's one of the reasons why the book has become so widely used. And the problem with it is is that if you meet criteria for a certain diagnosis, then that can be helpful because it kind of gives you an understanding of the group that you fall into, other people that might have similar conditions, and it might give you some guidance as to the treatments that you might seek. But if you don't meet criteria, right, if you fall outside of the line of whichever criteria you have, then you're it can really invalidate your experience where it feels like you don't actually have a thing or you don't have a condition or what you're experiencing is not legitimate. And that's really problematic when we think about the trying to get through healthcare, like trying to survive and trying to thrive even as a healthcare professional, because the way in which we respond to trauma, the way in which we respond to difficult scenarios and situations and stress is going to be very different. And not everybody meets the criteria to fit into the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And when you look at this, even when you look at like a major disaster, where there's a large group of people that are exposed to a traumatic event, like a really terrible scenario, um, the responses that people are very widely, and in fact, depression is a more common response often than post-traumatic stress disorder is. Even though in some situations PTSD is relatively common, there's often other responses that are not wouldn't fall within that criteria. These are all folks that are suffering as a result, and it's not that helpful to have this very kind of strict line like you're in and you're out. Okay. The definition that I want to run with a little bit today is just from Bessel van der Kolk. Some of you may have read his book. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. I think he has a few other books out there, but he is an expert in trauma and the treatment of trauma. And his definition is broader. Trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It's the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. So this is a much broader way of understanding it. It's an imprint, but what that imprint actually looks like, or what the trauma itself has to be, doesn't have to be narrowly defined. All right, so in healthcare, it is a particular environment where healthcare professionals are facing stresses and traumas that are different from the rest of the population. So there's particular things to keep in mind when we're thinking about what we experience in healthcare. And a lot of that has to do with workload, which is often unpredictable. There's often a lot of time pressures, and the amount of just the volume can be a huge pressure in terms of the the making people more vulnerable to yeah, sorry. So the question, in terms of PTSD not being only mental but physical and neurological, yes, absolutely. We're going to actually get into that because the nature of PTSD is that there's often like a very strong physical component to it, which we'll talk about in a second. So we will definitely get there. And often that's the louder part of it actually. Okay, so in terms of understanding why healthcare professionals might be particularly vulnerable to this, it's not just workload, just the volume of adverse events and the volume of difficult situations is much higher, right? People in healthcare are much more likely to be exposed to death, and not just once. Again, another problem with the DSM diagnosis, it was really designed for specific event type trauma where it was like a disaster or a car accident or a thing that happened. But in healthcare, often it's not quite as simple in that. There might be a single disaster or a single terrible event that a person can point to, but often there are other things, right? There are other things that led up to it, other traumas, other events that may also be contributing to it, and certainly other stressors. So just the volume of that. The emotional demands of this work are kind of different than other areas of work. We're dealing with people, either um, our patients or our uh, family members of patients. The emotion levels are high. Um, just looking at the question. Yeah, so the question right now is about the pain, but also the stress, right? And the effect that these things have. So, yes, so now pain can be another thing, right? And so actually that's what I want to talk about, right? Because when we think about trauma narrowly, like PTSD, it has these symptoms, it has these things. It's sometimes it's a very narrow definition. When we think about things like sleep disruption or pain, sleep and pain can be very closely connected. Depression, other aspects of this all fit within the same sort of spectrum of problems, but and pain might just be one of those extra symptoms. So I'll try and let me think about as we go through it. I haven't brought up pain specifically, in a way just because I don't think I had the time, but let me think as we go through it. I'll try to bring up and think about where pain might fit into this because it's actually a really important problem that um, well, on the note for in terms of healthcare providers, I am talking primarily about emotional pain today and the physical aspect of that. But the other thing to keep in mind is that in healthcare, often it is physically demanding, and that people are left with physical injuries as well as psychological injuries. Um, the other thing I just want to mention also about healthcare is that healthcare is a culture that has evolved, right? And that we have sometimes created social structures and cultural conventions that in some ways may help us cope with difficult situations, and there's times where it makes sense, when you are dealing with a really difficult situation. Being overwhelmed by your emotions might not be ideal, and so we may become very good at ignoring emotions, pushing them aside, focusing on the work. That can be very helpful in a crisis situation, but sometimes the things that we've learned to do as a culture aren't helpful in the long run, especially when it comes to recovering and trying to regain our function. That the thing that may help in one situation actually causes harm in others. So I want to just note that expectations and the culture in healthcare sometimes are unhelpful. Um, okay, so what I want to broaden this a little bit, and I'm going to actually pull from the Canadian military, believe it or not. And while I realize the military and healthcare are in many ways different, there are a lot of similarities between how the military has tried to approach trauma and how we might be able to approach it in healthcare that I think actually is better than trying to, again, the narrow definitions. And so what in the military, what they do is they define these things as operational stress injuries. And so stress injuries are a range of problems that can arise in the course of someone's duties, right, in the military. But these same things overlap. There's some differences, but there's like an amazing amount of overlap between what we have to deal with in healthcare as what folks will deal with in the military. One is which that the nature of the trauma is often much more prolonged and chronic than it is a single event, right? That if we think so. Someone brought up in the questions just the COVID and going through it, and that wasn't it, in a way it kind of we can refer to it as one event, but for in healthcare it was a series of things, right? And there was a lot. It was a period of time where a lot was happening, and so defining it as one narrow event is not going to be as helpful as kind of thinking about the different things that can go wrong actually when we're dealing with these levels of stress. So the first operational stress injury that they talk about is trauma, and this fits with acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, and they refer to it as an impact injury. And this is the result of a single or a couple of um, a single event. Is operational stress injuries recognized by doctors and government? Um, not in a narrowly defined sense, no. I mean, it's a way of approaching these problems. Underneath all of these things, there are problems that are recognized, right? So under the trauma, it is post-traumatic stress disorder. So we can define disorders in each of these categories. The fatigue injuries are typically major depressive disorder, although there are chronic pain disorders that would be considered part of that, or different injuries related to kind of physical health, actually. But again, the reason why I think this is a really useful thing is rather than trying to figure out which problem you have from a list, you are thinking about a range of problems that will emerge as a result of stress. Because even though I'm dividing this into four different things, they almost always there's elements of both or both of all of these things when people are going through extreme stress. that it's not just that you have the impact of a trauma, that it's often in the context of extreme fatigue from chronic stress and incredible loss, as well as moral distress, which is what we'll talk about. And that is what the research, when we look at the research on trauma, that seems to be the things that sort of contribute to whether people experience a traumatic injury or not, is all of these other context factors. It's not the event itself that causes the trauma. It obviously that's the precipitant, but it's all of the other vulnerabilities that have kind of stacked up. The crazy working hours, the fatigue, the isolation, all of those things, which I want to talk about in a second. Sorry, I'm just going to see the question. So pain and depression are linked actually, and so actually let's get into it. It's complicated because pain might be related to depression. So there's certain aspects of a depression that can lead to pain, but also actually the anxiety associated with trauma actually is often very closely connected to pain. Some of that has to do on the level of the nerves, the pain nerves, and that can lead to chronic pain, but it can also lead to some of the physical aspects of the anxiety itself can lead to chronic pain. Okay, sorry. So fatigue injuries are the military describe it as wear and tear. I would describe it more as chronic stress that people have difficulty escaping from, where a person feels very little control over the levels of stress that they're facing, and it's an accumulative stress. So facing a week of that sort of stress, often people are actually pretty good at that. So some stresses, humans are actually very good at tolerating stress in short duration, but chronic stress, repeated stress, like and without, one of the things we know about stress is when people feel like they have control over it, stress actually can be quite good. It's, people do all kinds of things that are stressful, but they do it for fun in a way. They climb mountains and run marathons and things like that. But these are all stresses that people have control over, which are radically different from being, stuck in crazy shifts in the middle of a pandemic and all of that, where people often have very little control. Grief is the third injury, and grief has to do with loss, right? And that people are experiencing losses, whether it's of patients, whether it's colleagues, whether it's also their roles, right? So it doesn't just have to be loss of people, but it can be loss of aspirations and their hopes and things like that actually can have a profound effect. And each of these is different, by the way, right? So a trauma response is different from a depressed response, which is different from a grief response. And the last one is moral injury. And in healthcare, I think it's usually we refer to this as moral distress. I include this here just because it's such a critical part of all of this, and it contributes to all of these other things, fatigue and burnout, and all of these other things. It's not an area that I have expertise in, other than I've experienced it, certainly, especially when I was in institutional settings. So we'll touch a bit on it, and I'll give you some thoughts about how you might approach it, but there isn't a ton of research on what we do to kind of help with this compared to these other three. So we'll touch on it, but I won't spend a lot of time on it. We're going to talk about function and the rewiring actually now. So yes, there's a sort of rewiring. Okay, so I'm going to focus on trauma specifically and kind of how the rewiring happens. So um, when we think about all of these things, depression, grief, the trauma response, and maybe even the moral injury, there's an aspect of all of these responses to stress and trauma that you could imagine are adaptive. Actually, they're ways of coping and surviving difficult situations. And what happens is they can go haywire, they can go wrong. And the reasons why that might be will vary from person to person. But one of the things to think about when you're thinking about these different responses is think that, oh, in a way, this could be trying to help you in a way. So with a trauma response, it's again, remember it's an impact injury. And so it's something happens that leads to like a sense of extreme terror, right? Like extreme fear, and often in the context of helplessness, right? Like not being able to do anything about it. And in those situations, our brain registers that on a very, very deep level, and it holds on to it in our memory. And it will remind you again and again to protect you so that you never go back to that place where, you know, this terrible thing happened, where you almost drowned or where you were almost attacked or whatever it might be, where you almost died. And so your brain sends you reminders, right? Now, whether that actually happened, whether it was actually your life in danger, whether you may have it may have been a patient who died, or it may have been something else. And so maybe your life was never actually in danger, but it doesn't really matter. Your brain has decided it's extremely dangerous and will remind you over and over again to not do that again. And what it does then is put you in a state of alarm a lot of the time, especially if there's any cues or any triggers present that are going to remind you of the past. And so you're in a state of what we sometimes call hypervigilance or hyperarousal. And it's a physiological activated state. So your brain and your body are all activated, ready to escape at any moment if it needs to, right? So it's not quite the same as fear. You might not even know you're afraid. You might be going about your business and think it's fine, but a sound or something you see or do can suddenly set you off into like an intense period of anxiety. And that's that alarm system that's become very, very sensitive. And it leads to kind of a sense of edginess. There's often a lot of muscle tension, and so this is one way in which chronic pain can emerge, is because your muscles are tense. It's funny, as I'm even thinking about this right now, um, I notice my shoulders are up, which is what happens when you're a bit tense, right? I'm a little bit activated too, right? Because I'm hoping I can give a good presentation. And so when you're activated in a scared situation, in a situation of fear, it's often the tension can go on for days or hours. It's there all the time. And you may not even be fully aware of it until you get a terrible headache or you get incredible muscle pain, right? It actually also can contribute to exhaustion, which we'll talk about in the next slide, because your muscles are always sort of like in this state of tension. People are often very quick to startle, and they're often very, very sensitive, right? So their senses are on high alert. So, and then the last part is basically avoidance, right? Where the person then avoids the memories. They avoid anything that might trigger their startle. They avoid the kind of very negative experience that they are experiencing in their body. Sometimes this is an active, conscious process. It's like, well, I'm not gonna drive. You know, this is very common in people who have been in a car accident and have PTSD from that, is they don't want to go in the car, or they don't want to go to busy intersections or the specific intersection where they were in an accident. And so they'll avoid those things. But often avoidance is not conscious. You're not even aware of it. It's a unconscious numbing where you feel distant and you kind of depersonalize yourself, and you might go about your workday without really thinking or feeling a lot about it. You're kind of removed in a way that helps you to not be in the state of chronic tension and helps you not to have these memories. Um, okay. So in terms of, so this is not an on purpose thing, right? Like I said, sometimes people are deliberately avoiding things that are going to cause this alarm system to go off, which makes sense. You're not going to go to a place that makes you feel horrible. So sometimes there are elements of this that are on purpose, right? Most of it's not, though, I will say, right? It's certainly not on purpose that you're in the state of tension, and it's definitely not on purpose that you're getting reminders all the time. People don't have nightmares and they don't have recurrence and re-experiencing. Some of the avoidance will be on purpose, right? Like the which is understandable. And in fact, there might be an important part of that, although I do want to talk about what you might do to kind of push back a bit on some of the avoidance. But certainly the numbing, the depersonalizing that people experience, even some of the isolation is a fairly automatic response that people have. Um, in terms of the understanding of, just to kind of the Understanding of trauma, and why, say, a lot of physicians don't really understand it. And I do think it gets back to some of the defenses we've learned in healthcare that I mean, I trained for 5 years in psychiatry, which is should be you would think would be all about emotions, right? That we would learn and understand a lot about. We did get training on PTSD for sure, but it's amazing how little we hear about emotions or understand emotions. I think that one of the things that we do in medicine, when we're trying to cope with awful stuff, right, and is our we understand things in I think we like to boil things down to very simple ideas. So, for example, we think about PTSD and depressions in terms of neurotransmitters, right? And we like to think about molecules because molecules, we trained to learn about molecules. We don't want to think about the kind of terror that people experience and the much broader experience that people have. And so, I don't exactly know why um, the the healthcare on a broader sense doesn't. I think they're trying. I do think we are trying to recognize trauma as an important thing, but I think we have so far to go, actually. Okay. Actually, I have a question. Does Can everyone see the questions? I hope so. If everyone can't see the question, because I realize I'm responding to questions, um, but I can also repeat the questions. So. Okay, let me talk about depression. So the operational stress folks call this a fatigue-related injury. And again, the reason why I like the ideas of OSI is that they don't really care whether you check the boxes and whether you actually have clinical depression or not. It's like if you're suffering, let's try and help you. And I think that's a more compassionate way of approaching these things. But I will talk about depression because that is what we're talking about, and you're going to see different degrees of depression. Depression has two components to it, typically. And again, there's a physical and a psychological, although I'll say that, those things are never so separate. The, and so now remember, depression is a response of chronic stress, right? That the accumulation of stress over time is likely the main cause of depression. Now, the big caveat here is depression, we've recognized it's been around for thousands of years. We know a lot about it, and yet there's still not a consensus about what depression actually is. And so, we've accumulated a lot of research. We had an idea about serotonin, which probably a lot of folks have heard about, that depression is an insufficient amount of serotonin. Turns out that's not true. It's much, much more complicated than that. Serotonin plays a role, but but the the thing that makes the most sense to me and that I think lines up the most with the research we have is that depression is a response of chronic stress. My apologies. It's a response to chronic stress. And so imagine a person, and that it's been around for, probably before humans were around, right? That you can see elements of depression in animals that are, other mammals. But for humans, when faced with chronic stress, what can happen is what gets triggered is a sort of hibernation, actually. And in fact, there's some evidence. This is weaker, but there is some evidence that in fact depression activates some circuitry that is similar to hibernation, right? So that, when imagine that you're facing a winter where you're not going to have access to food or you're not going to have access to, the conditions are going to be much more adverse. The weather's going to be bad. For some animals, the best thing to do is to find a cave somewhere and shut off the lights and go to bed for 3 months. And in a way, that is what happens in depression, is that people are faced with chronic stress, and at some point, it's like, yeah, stay in the cave, right? Like stay home, um, and you go into a state of like a metabolic change, right, where you kind of go into a state of shutdown, right? And so it's a deactivation. Um, and in fact, when we look at depression, right, and we think about the changes that happen with depression, there are certainly psychological changes, but a lot of them are physical, right? Our appetite changes. Sometimes it's eating more, but again, you see that in hibernation, right? Before you hibernate, you eat more, and then some people eat less, which is, this period of kind of isolation and basically holding tight until the stress passes, right? Until you can kind of emerge again on the other side. So now the thing I want to point out is understanding depression as an adaptive response going wrong is a useful way of thinking it. I'm not saying that depression is good, to be clear, but I'm saying this is the mechanism that we have. It's the thing that is in our genes in a way, and understanding that that kind of physiological change is part of it is really important, because what people do is, and this was kind of hinted at in one of the questions, people kind of blame themselves, right? They say, oh, I can't do anything, I need to try harder, I need it. But it's like you're in a physiologically altered state. You will feel you really don't have as much energy when you're depressed. Your body is not making it available to you. It is deliberately reducing your motivation to things as a sort of misguided protective factor. Now, what's interesting in depression is you've got a physiological, your body is shutting down, but your brain is not. That often people in depression, their brain goes into hyperdrive. So it's like, yes, you go into a physical retreat, but your mind does something we call ruminating. And ruminating is an interesting word. It comes from, if anyone is from the prairies, they'll know that a ruminant is a animal that chews on sort of low nutritious food, swallows it, and then regurgitates it, and then chews on it some more. It's this cycle of trying to like chew through things. And I think that's a good image of the way people's thinking works in depression. It's this chewing on specific thoughts and trying to understand things and getting really, really stuck. And then, as soon as you've kind of put it away, it comes back. And so it's this very, very kind of perseverative, repeated thinking of things over and over again. Now, again, you could imagine that this might be helpful if you had a problem to solve, right? You had to figure out how to, manage your food better, or change your situation, or whatever it might be. But what happens often in depression is those thoughts are self-critical, that the thing that they're chewing on are attacks on themselves, which actually increases their stress. Okay. Um, Grief and loss. So grief is so depression and PTSD are problems, right? These are even though there might be parts of them that you could imagine are trying to help. Grief, though, is very different. Grief is healthy. Grief is a part of life. Grief is really about how do we heal. People get stuck in something we call complicated grief, but grief has two main components. Again, if some of you have read Kubler-Ross, The Stages of Grief, or you've heard of the stages of grief, what she pointed out was that grief is a complicated thing, right? And there are a complicated range of emotions that people experience with grief. But what I think are the sort of more modern approach to it is recognize that there's these two components, because people don't go through the stages of grief in any particular order, it turns out, and they don't experience all of the stages of grief. What does seem to be important in grief is these two components. One is remembering, which is there's a lot of remembering in grief, and this is very different from the remembering of PTSD. Right? The remembering in PTSD is intrusive, unwanted, and anxiety provoking. The remembering in grief is when it's healthy, is painful, but not painful in a way in which you want to avoid. It's a painful sort of emotional experience that often is associated with a range of emotions, not just sadness. We often think of sadness, obviously that's a big one with loss, but it can be anger and frustration, and it can be fear, but it can even be joy, and so you can get a range of emotions. And it turns out that seems to be an important part of recovery, is remembering and experiencing emotions, and then this returning, right? So grief will kind of knock us back, and we often aren't able to function as we're processing the emotions, but then we do. We do kind of figure out how to return to life, and it's returning in a way that's different, like recognizing. So grief is different than sadness because it's this process of dealing with a loss that's big, right? Like it's having a major impact. You could think about sadness it's certainly about loss as well, but sadness is about loss of things that you'll easily manage without, right? It's you lost your favorite bag, or you lost, I don't know, a game that you really hoping to win, or you lost some money, or whatever. Like that's sadness, right? Grief is when you need to rethink everything. You need to reprocess things. You need to figure out how to go on without the thing that you had lost, right? And so there's this balance between remembering and returning that we see with grief. Okay. Um, Sorry, I missed a whole bunch of questions. Um, so these things all interact. Um, can you grieve your past self? Okay, so yeah, all of these things are interacting, right? So I'm giving you sort of four pictures of the problems that emerge, but there you could see, right? The grief has remembering just like PTSD does. And this is why it gets so complicated because when you are trying to process and grieve, say, your past self, and so yes, your past self, the way you functioned before, the way you managed before, if that's something that you've lost, then grieving is probably a really important part of the process, and recovering involves some way of disentangling that from the traumatic memories, and we're going to talk about that, how those things uh, you can sort of get some distance from them, if that makes sense. I think I got oh, in terms of the grief, when the grief doesn't pass, and how long does the grief take? Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. So grief, um, it doesn't have an end. So this was actually a big debate in the new DSM, right? Was how long do we allow people to grieve before we intervene? And again, the DSM is this sort of like, um, uh, you have it or you don't, or how long should you grieve before, it's not healthy anymore? And that is a very, I don't think that's a question. We try to answer it in the DSM, so it's like 6 months or something like that. I think I can't remember. It's new. It just came out last year, but the process doesn't end actually, right? Like it is about regaining function and returning back, and in a way it's never the same, right? And that's hard, and that's painful, and that's the part that needs to be processed. So I wish I could give you like a clear answer. If it's not passing, well, I want to talk about that, right? Because people do get stuck in grief. And again, I'm going to give you some hints as to what might be going wrong, but it's so variable, and it often involves people getting stuck on one side or the other. Okay, moral distress. This again, this is something that a little less um, capable of talking about, just because it's not in my wheelhouse as much, except it's, again, I've been there and I've experienced it, and more, but just and it's such an important concept, right? So I have to talk about it, but I think it's under researched and it's underappreciated in terms of, and so the way that the operational stress injuries break it up is trauma is a impact, uh, uh, as a result of impact, or an impact injury. Depression is a wear and tear. It's a buildup of stress type injury. Grief is a loss injury. And then it also said this moral distress is a type of loss injury. They kind of categorize it as that, which in a way you could see how this could be similar to the person who mentioned like the grieving your loss, your old self, and that the stress can be uh, of moral injury can be not being able to be the person you wanted to be or do the things that you feel like you need to do, and that's in a way, I think it's almost like a spiritual injury, right? It's where our values, the things that are most important to us, conflict with the work that we're doing, right? You can't help the way you were supposed to help, or the way you see it's important to help. Sometimes this can be conflict with choices that your patients make, right? And you want to help someone who refuses to be helped. And that's hard, right? But in a way that um, can't be helped, in a way, in a healthcare world where we value autonomy and people making their own choices. And so in a way that is, you know, you have to come to an understanding of that. For a lot of people, though, the moral distress is worse when it's the organization that you work for, or the legal system, or the broken healthcare system, or the broken mental health system. In my case, it's where you you see a way to help people, but you can't, right? For bureaucratic reasons. And that has, again, I think, it has an effect on our values, and has an emotional effect. But I don't know how to describe it better than it has an effect on your soul, right? Like that it there's a pain that seems to have a spiritual component to it, right? It's deep. It affects our most important values. Okay, so I'll want to get to sort of the things to help, but I just want you to understand exactly how some of these happen. So I want to talk about the trauma cycle specifically. So remember, there's these three elements. You've got reminders, triggers that bring up the past. Then there's this anxiety-related fear response, where your body is activated, your heart rate's up, your muscles are tense, you're like ready to fight or flight kind of thing, and then you avoid. And the problem with this pattern is that all of these things feed back into each other, and avoidance, is one of these things that actually that amplifies the cycle. And so one of the things that I want to give you is just two different graphs about different ways in which fear and the way in which we respond to fear. The first graph is basically a graph of what happens when you avoid fear. And basically this is, something happens that you experience extreme fear, and then you do everything in your power to escape it. And sometimes that might be leave the situation. Sometimes it might be get help from somebody else. It might be, for some people, it's using drugs and alcohol, actually. And so this is kind of the pattern that happens over time. Oh, it was supposed to go slower. And so I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you kind of follow the first bump here, this is a person who's experiencing fear, and the fear sort of plateaus at some point, and the person at this point is trying to escape. They're trying to get away from the fear, and eventually they do, which leads to a rapid reduction in fear, right? Which feels real, like relief, extreme relief, right? And so whatever helped you here to escape from the fear, your brain registers that and says, I need this, right? I know, and that could be avoidance. I need to not go to that place. It could be a drug. Again, it could be anything that helps you to feel better. Here's the problem, is that it now you have to be on guard, right? And you have to be on the lookout for the thing that's gonna trigger the fear, which happens here, and the thing that's gonna help you escape it. And so your baseline anxiety goes up, the fear comes back. Now you are a bit more prepared, right? You've been on guard, you're ready, you've got, the tools that you're going to use to help yourself. And so the fear may not be as high and it may not be as long, but it'll go back down, right? And but what's happened is your brain is rewiring. Someone mentioned that earlier. As your brain rewires, you are now at a new level of anxiety. And this happens, and the anxiety periods actually get shorter. You are able to successfully navigate it, and it gives the illusion of success, right? You've escaped. It feels like this extreme relief, like you've escaped danger, but over time your baseline anxiety has gone up. And the cognitive component of this is that your brain has learned that these things are dangerous, and it never learns that if you stay with it, if you didn't avoid, maybe it would have been fine. Maybe you would have gotten through. Now, so there is, now remember, we mentioned earlier, some of this avoidance might be things that you do voluntarily, but sometimes it's automatic, right? So you're avoiding You might even still be doing your work, right? You might be still showing up to work, doing your job, but the avoidance is that depersonalization. You just don't feel, you don't think about your work, you don't attend to, like, you might be attending in a very sort of automatic way, but you're avoiding the kind of emotions of it, for example. So if you stay with fear, this is generally the pattern that fear happens, assuming that you're in a safe situation, a situation where you're not in danger. But fear stays high and then gradually goes away. And each time you go back, the fear will get a little bit lower and a little bit lower, a little bit lower. And this is kind of the core treatment we use for all anxiety disorders, is that if we can help people to experience their fear, which is kind of crazy, experience their fear in a situation that's safe, not dangerous. And actually, I have it up here that it gets quite high, but actually, typically in my practice, I would want people not to go much higher than this, right? I'd want to keep it uncomfortable, believe it or not, which is not great, but you don't want people to be overwhelmed by fear. But over time, the intensity of fear does come down. And the real advantage of this is that the person learns over time that the fear is, I mean, it doesn't go away entirely, but it becomes tolerable. And the baseline fear does not go up. So you're not living in fear. You're only experiencing fear when it happens, if that makes sense. Whereas the previous was you're living in fear. Okay, sorry. So depression has a similar kind of feedback loop that happens as PTSD, where stress leads to this physiological deactivation, and the person ruminates, right? And so this combination, it's when that physiological deactivation, people withdraw, right, from the things that are causing them the stress, which actually isn't the problem. The problem is when that withdrawal, people are withdrawing from the other things that give them meaning and give them purpose and give them hope and give them joy, and all of those positive things, give them a sense of connection to other people. So when people are withdrawing, but they're losing the things that actually reduce their stress, it actually increases their stress in depression, right? Again, someone who withdraws a little bit, but maybe seeks out friends more or seeks out activities that give them more um, joy, might be in a very different place and might not find themselves in the depressive loop. And similarly, when the ruminations are self-critical, they're attacks on the person's self, it increases their stress, which increases their deactivation. So what I see a lot in my practice is people who are in this state of physiological shutdown, and they expect themselves to just go back to work or just go back to school or just, and just is the key word here, that it's a simple thing to do by just trying harder or putting their mind to it or all those things. And the truth is that for lots of people, especially people in healthcare, is they have been able to do that in the past, right? They've been able to push themselves to get through and to go forward. Um, and now they can't. And so that leads to more self-criticism. Okay. The things that can make these things worse, and again, I wouldn't say always these things make things worse, but these are often the things that people will do to try to make themselves feel better, but often in the long run, lead to problems. Social isolation and social withdrawal are often a big problem. People feel more alone, more isolated, and one of the things I've always been, a big fan of is groups, because when I'm in my office and I just see people individually, I see so many people going through kind of awful stuff, but they often feel isolated. They don't feel like anyone's going through it. They don't realize that I've got 8 other people on my calendar that day that are going to have maybe not the same problems, but very similar struggles. Avoidance in can be a big part of the problem. Some avoidance makes sense, right? It's not that you should overwhelm yourself with fear. It's not that you should put yourself in situations that are extremely stressful, but complete avoidance often complicates things. Quick fixes also tend to do a couple of things. One is they kind of reinforce that pattern of stress, get out of it very quickly. The other problem with quick fixes is it feeds into this simplified idea of the solution to my problem is to just, try harder or just wake up earlier or just, you know, take this vitamin or whatever it might be. But actually these things are way more complicated. And when we kind of treat these things as simple, it actually often contributes to that blame, right? People feel like, well, why is this my problem if it's as simple as, taking this vitamin or why can't I just get up earlier? Overextending yourself, focusing entirely on your work, just kind of like, doubling down, unhelpful. And then the big thing is unrealistic expectations. And people might be surprised to hear is, believe it or not, positive thinking can really be a problem, right? Where people think, I've just got to keep going. Okay, sorry, I realize we're running out of time. I want to talk a little bit about where you're going to go to help with this, and maybe we'll do another talk at some point. So this is a quote from Aristotle. Virtue is the golden mean between two vices, the one of excess and the other of deficiency. And I really like this quote. It's very like old, but the idea is balance, right? That the way out is not by picking an extreme, but finding the middle path. So in trauma, what we do actually, instead of having memories and avoiding them, we actually get people in a safe situation to actually deliberately remember the thing, right? I have a colleague in Quebec who designs virtual reality simulators where people actually, believe it or not, go into a computer simulation of their trauma, right? And they help them to learn. Obviously, it's a very controlled environment where it helps them to learn that the thing that causes them fear actually, when it's a memory, is not a threat. It's not dangerous. And at the same time, we work to reduce that level of physiological activation, right? And if you look at the Bessel van der Kolk stuff or the Peter Levine or the stuff on trauma, a lot of it is focused on how do we reduce the kind of adrenaline, the sympathetic drive, and to try to focus more on reducing it, which is really interesting because in a way that's the opposite of what we do with depression. Whereas in depression, because you're deactivated, we try to get people activated. We try to get people moving, not in a way where it's like, go and run a marathon tomorrow. It's like, do what you can, do a little bit more, do these much small incremental steps, and then really learning to like recognize and adapt that kind of self-critical thinking style. With grief, grief is a process that honestly, it's allowing it to run its course and not trying to rush it, not hanging on to just the remembering or just focusing on recovery, but both remembering, allowing the process to happen, and then realizing the gradual return is going to be a bumpy ride. When you are kind of re-understanding how your life and how you move forward, what you'll find is it's a bit of trial and error, right? It's, oh, I can't do that I used to be able to do, and then figuring out how do I do that, right? And that will be associated with emotions and processing the emotions. With moral distress, again, this is one that I'm going to pull from DBT and suggest a solution, although I don't think there's a ton of evidence for this. I think moral distress, where you are in a system that isn't consistent with your values, is that there's some measure of balancing acceptance and change, where on the one hand, there's going to be things that you can't change, and fighting and pushing on the things that you can't change is going to exhaust you, and it's going to be demoralizing. On the other hand, throwing up your arms and saying there's nothing I can do, it is the way it is also kind of equally demoralizing. And so again, there's this balance between at times accepting, at times working towards change. One of my favorite quotes is from Carl Rogers, who talked about acceptance and change. I think he was the first person to kind of, this was before people were into mindfulness, and maybe he studied Zen Buddhism, I don't know, but this was Carl Rogers. Um, Things that help pretty consistently is talking about these things, right? That having a conversation with people, coming to a talk like this, and learning more about it, and self-compassion. I'm a big fan of, and self-compassion is an interesting thing. It's not just being nice to yourself, right? It's not just thinking good thoughts about yourself. It's a process of sort of distancing yourself a little bit from, and not getting totally overwhelmed by your experience, but recognizing your experience is sort of is part of being human, actually, and there's other people going through it. And then instead of judging yourself, having some kindness and space for yourself. And of course, getting help, right? I do hope that one thing, I do hope people have a sense of where they might go after this, but I hope people really recognize these are really complicated issues, right? And figuring out ways to get help with this, often that's with, a therapist, to be honest, because these are psychological things that are difficult to, and to the point about family doctors, at best they have 20 minutes 3 times a year kind of thing. So they don't have a lot of time to talk about this stuff. Um, all right. 1 minute to spare. I sorry, I don't have a lot of time for questions, but I could. Oh, sorry, there's a bunch of questions. Okay, sorry, I've got lots of questions. I'm just um, so in terms of seeking medical help for this, it's really tricky, right? Because, the thing is, we're in a system that we don't have a lot of primary care. In terms of the medical field, there's not a lot of time, and in terms of psychiatry, even psychiatrists aren't necessarily, we often are very specialized, and so we don't necessarily talk about trauma and those sorts of things. I do think some of these things, having a therapist, it can be very powerful, right? And having groups of people who also understand some of what someone's going through. Having a good family doctor is a really good thing. And the thing that the someone, I think one of the questions is about whether, being told that this stuff is all in your head. And that one is drives me a little crazy, because it's just, number one, it's not true. And even if it was true, it doesn't matter, right? That certainly, our health, dividing our health into stuff in your head and stuff in your body is not really going to be that helpful or that useful. And so, um, I don't know. Again, I think that it's very difficult to navigate this if your physician feels like um, your symptoms or your experience are not valid, right? Actually understanding and recognizing that your symptoms are valid are is really important. So, in terms of helping yourself, as I think that was one of the questions, it is. I've got some resources, and some of them are focused more on PTSD, some of them are focused more on depression, and so I think we'll be sending those out, if I'm right, Cecilia? So we'll send some of those things out, so you'll have some connections. But yeah, so that's all I have, folks. I do hope you are able to find the resources useful, and I hope you found the talk useful.